F. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same cribbing tone and articulate style while slightly altering the word order and sentence structure. نجمة. Somewhere along the moist bayous of southern Louisiana, in the brutal summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds. It was not from yellow fever. It was not from consumption. With surgical precision, each one had his throat opened while he slept. At dawn, their bodies were discovered, expressions frozen between ecstasy and terror. All 11 were prominent members of the region's most feared chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia. As unrelated incidents spread across 4 parishes, local authorities documented the deaths, filing reports that contradicted both witness statements and physical evidence. Within 6 months, the case was quietly closed, war records sealed by order of the parish judge. But in the cramped quarters of the colored sections, in the back rooms of Freedmen's churches, another story circulated. For generations, it would be whispered, never written down, never spoken aloud where white ears might hear. Tonight, that story can finally be told. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called La Fille Noire, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this one, stories that were deliberately buried, that powerful men wanted forgotten, these are what we uncover on this channel. In the comments, tell me what state you are listening from. Are you hearing this from Louisiana, from the deep south? I want to know where our community is watching these forgotten histories come to light. The story begins not in 1872, but 4 years earlier, in the ashes of a war that had supposedly ended. St. Martin Parish in 1868 was a wound refusing to heal. Against the Louisiana sky, the grand plantations that had once produced sugar and cotton by the ton stood like rotting teeth. Their fields were returning to swamp. Their manor houses, occupied by federal troops, were left to collapse under the weight of their own former glory. The parish seat was the town of Bridge, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clustered around a courthouse that had changed flags 3 times in 7 years. In ways that terrified the old planter class, the population had shifted. Nearly 4,000 former slaves walked freely through streets where they'd once been forbid even to make contact with white residents. Some of them owned property. Protected by the presence of Union soldiers and the Freedmen's Bureau, they fought. In courts of law, they testified against white defendants, in infraction of the natural order so profound that many long-time residents spoke of it as a kind of apocalypse, the end of civilization itself. In response, from the remnants of Confederate veteran societies and local militias, the Knights of the White Camellia had emerged. The Louisiana Knights prided themselves on a certain sophistication, unlike their more famous counterparts in other states. They burned no crosses. They wore no hoods. They were lawyers, merchants, former officers, plantation owners trying to salvage what remained of their holdings. The local courts, the sheriff's office, the parish council, they controlled them all. They didn't need theatrics. They had bar. Their tactics were surgical. A freedman who spoke too boldly in town might find his crops burned, his mule hamstrung, his credit at the general store suddenly revoked. At night, a colored man who registered to vote might be visited by well-dressed gentlemen who explained quite reasonably why he should reconsider. For those who proved intractable, violence was saved, and even then it was calculated, designed to send a message without attracting federal intervention. Every Thursday evening, the Knights met in a back room of the Bridge Hotel, a 3-story establishment on Main Street owned by one of their founding members, Harold Jessup. The inner circle, the decision-makers, came praise the 11 men who determined which freedmen needed reminding of their place, which white Republicans needed encouragement to leave the parish, which federal sympathizers required more aggressive persuasion. Into this battercock walked a woman who called herself Celeste Dafra. On a Tuesday morning in late April, she appeared in Bow Bridge, stepping off the steamboat from New Orleans with a cynical trunk and a parasol of black silk. She was perhaps 13 years old, though her face held a quality that made age difficult to determine. Not young, not old, but somehow outside the normal progression of years. The color of her skin was cafeola, that ambiguous shade which Louisiana could mean anything from Creole aristocracy to mixed parentage of a dozen different origins. Expensive couture the morning clothes she wore, the kind of garments that required a skilled seamstress and fine fabric, suggesting the means and status. At the Bow Bridge Hotel, she took a room, buying a month in advance with gold coins that she counted at one by one onto Harold Jessup's front desk. Her French was flawless, her English spoken with a Parisian accent that fascinated the locals. She claimed to be the widow of a French merchant who had died in New Orleans during the yellow fever outbreak of the previous summer. She was, she said, looking to purchase property in the parish, perhaps a small house with land where she might live quietly, away from the disease and chaos of the city. The story was plausible enough. A devastating epidemic had indeed struck New Orleans. French merchants did business throughout Louisiana. In smaller communities, well-bred Creole widows often sought refuge. And something about Celeste Dafra discouraged close questioning, a dignity, a self-position that suggested she was accustomed to being treated with respect. Every Sunday morning, she attended Mass at St. Bernard Catholic Church, sitting in the section reserved for Creole families of standing. Always alone, she took her meals in the hotel dining room, reading French novels or writing letters in a neat, precise hand. In the afternoons, she walked through town, her parasol shading her face, nodding politely to those she passed, but initiating no conversations. She seemed to have no interest in the racial tensions that consumed the parish, no political opinions, no connections to either the freedmen's community or the federal authorities. Within 2 weeks, she had caught the attention of every man on the Knights Council. It started innocently enough. Outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, Thomas Broussard, who owned 1,500 acres of straggling cotton fields east of town, encountered her. With a practiced touch, her cleft hands were moving over a bolt of fabric. He offered his assistance. He knew the merchant, he said, could ensure she received a fair price. A smile she gave him seemed to hold both gratitude and a hint of amusement, as if she found his chivalry charming but unnecessary. For perhaps 10 minutes they spoke, during which she mentioned her difficulties in finding suitable property, her unfamiliarity with the region, her reliance on the kindness of strangers in this difficult time of mourning. For the rest of the day, Broussard found himself thinking about her. Something magnetic was about her, a quality he couldn't quite name. It wasn't simply beauty, though she was undeniably attractive. It was a kind of focused attention, as if when she looked at you, you became the only person in the world who mattered. When she touched his arm lightly while thanking him for his help, he felt the contact like an electric current. He began finding reasons to be in the hotel lobby when she passed through. He offered to show her properties that might suit her needs. With a modesty that seemed to acknowledge both his generosity and her own vulnerable position as a woman alone, she accepted. Over the following days, they rode out to several pauses, always properly chaperoned, always concluding before sunset. To his wife, Broussard said these were potential business transactions, that he was helping a respectable widow, as any Christian gentleman would. But constantly he thought about Celeste. The way candlelight caught the curve of her neck, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the way her eyes met his, sometimes with an expression that seemed to see through all his careful respectability to something raw and hungry beneath. Broussard's distraction was noticed by the other knights, and gradually several of them began their own acquaintance with Madame Dafra. And Wallace, a lawyer who had defended several clan members in federal court, offered his legal services should she need assistance with property transfers. Dior, Raymond Aber, who served as a parish coroner, expressed concern about her health, the stress of widowhood, the changing climate, and suggested she might benefit from a consultancy. Eugene Fontenau, who ran the largest dry goods store in the parish, extended a generous line of credit for any household item she might need once she found her home. With the same gracious reserve, Celeste accepted each offer, never seeming to encourage attention, yet somehow making each man feel that he alone understood her situation, that he alone could provide what she needed. A respectable woman in difficult circumstances, they told themselves. Their interest was purely chivalrous. The fact that she occupied their thoughts, that they invented reasons to visit the hotel, that they found themselves making comparisons between her refined manner and their wife's provincial ways, these were simply natural responses to an exceptional woman. By June, the dynamic within the Knights Thursday meetings had subtly shifted. The 11 men who had always worked together with military precision now engaged in small rivalries, subtle competitions for status and standing. Broussard mentioned his afternoon drives with Madame Dafra. Lefes countered with his legal consultations. Aber spoke of her delicate constitution, her need for a physician's regular attention. The others, Jessup the hotel owner, Marcus Thibodeau who controlled the parish newspaper, Judge Vincent Thibodeau who had authority over the local courts, Sheriff Claude Defrau, banker Philip Brousseau, plantation owners William Duplantis and Charles Orsino. Each found their own ways to establish connection with the fascinating widow. That Celeste had never actually purchased any property, none of them noticed. Why a woman supposedly fleeing New Orleans would choose Bridge, a violent backwater town about by racial conflict, none of them questioned. For a craving widow, she seemed remarkably composed, never weeping, never speaking of her lost husband except in the fakest terms, none of them wondered at this. And none of them knew that late at night, after the hotel croquet, Celeste Dufresne sat at the small desk in her room and added notes to a leather-bound journal, recording each man's habits, his vulnerabilities, his secrets, his sins. She recorded where he lived, who guarded his house, whether his wife slept soundly, whether he kept weapons near his bed. She recorded everything she would need to know when the time came to collect her debts. Because Celeste Dafra, if that was even her real name, had not come to Bridge to purchase property or to mourn a husband or to escape yellow fever. For a very specific purpose she had come, one that required patience, planning, and a willingness to use a free weapon at her disposal. She had come to kill 11 men. On July 19 1872, during the worst hit wave anyone in St. Martin Parish could remember, the first death occurred. At dawn, Thomas Broussard's body was discovered by his wife. He lay in their bed in the plantation house he'd inherited from his father. From year to year, his throat was opened with such force that the cat had nearly reached his spine. Soaked through with blood or the sheets beneath him, as was the mattress, as was the floor beside the bed. Sharply contrasting with the peacefulness of his face was the violence of the wound. His eyes were closed, his features relaxed, his hands resting at his sides as if he'd simply drifted off to sleep and never awakened. Maura's Browsword's screams brought the household staff running. Among them was elderly colored woman named Esther, who had served the family since before the war, first as a slave, now as a bed servant. Years later, in testimony that would never make it into official records, Esther would describe what she saw when she entered that bedroom. Not just the body, not just the blood, but something else that made no sense, and that she immediately understood she should never speak of to white authorities. On the bedside table were two wine glasses, both empty. Of lavender and something else, something sweet and organic that Esther couldn't identify. The room smelled. Only his nightshirt was worn by a Maur, Browsword, which was wrapped around his thighs. In a pattern that suggested vigorous activity before death, the bedclothes were disturbed. And though Maur's Browsword had been sleeping in an adjacent bedroom, she suffered from insomnia and often took separate quarters to avoid disturbing her husband. There was clear evidence that Browsword had not been alone when he died. Within the hour, Sheriff Devereaux arrived along with the hour keeper. They examined the scene, questioned the servants, and established what would become the official narrative. By an intruder, likely a freedman with a grudge, Thomas Browsword had been murdered, who had crept into the house during the night and cut his throat while he slept. The killer had been swift and skilled, suggested the lack of signs of struggle. This was personal, not robbery, indicated the fact that nothing had been stolen. Perhaps, the sheriff speculated, it was retaliation for one of the many reminders the Knights had delivered to abbey-colored folks in recent months. But Esther, cleaning the room after the body had been removed, found something the white men had missed or chosen to ignore. Caught in the floorboards near the bed was a single long hair, dark and lustrous, too fine to belong to Maur's Browsword. And when she stripped the hats, she found them stained with more than just blood. There were other fluids present, evidence of activities that respectable people didn't discuss, but that every woman recognized. She said nothing. She burned the vets as Maur's Browsword instructed. She swept the floor clean, scrubbed the bloodstains, opened windows to air out the smell of death and secrets. And when the other servants asked her what she'd seen, she told them only what would keep them safe, that Maur Browsword had been killed by an intruder, that the sheriff was investigating, that they should all be careful not to go out alone at night. But in the colored section of town, among people who had run to see what white folks refused to acknowledge, a different story began to circulate. Whispers about the woman who had recently arrived in town, the beautiful widow who had caught the attention of so many prominent men. Whispers about Thomas Browsword's frequent visits to the hotel, the way he'd looked at Madame Devereaux, the afternoons he'd spent showing her properties that he never seemed to mention to his wife. About how convenient it was that a man known for his cruelty to freedmen, a man who had personally overseen the whipping of 3 colored men the previous month for the crime of trying to vote, had been found with his throat cut just days after he'd been seen dining privately with the mysterious Creole widow. On a Saturday, the funeral took place, the entire town turning out to pay respects. In a body, the Knights attended, standing together near the grave, their faces grim. These men were not fools. They recognized that the murder of one of their own was a message, a declaration of war. They assumed it came from the freedmen's community or from federal sympathizers. In low voices, they discussed how to respond, what measures to take, which colored leaders needed to be made examples of. That Celeste Dufresne attended the funeral as well, standing at a respectful distance, filled in black, her head bowed in apparent blur. None of them noticed. The small, satisfied smile that curved her lips when she thought no one was watching, none of them saw. And that in exactly 3 weeks there would be another funeral, none of them cast. On August 9, Antoine Les died in circumstances early similar to Broussard's death. In his bachelor quarters above his law office, he was found, throat cut, face bisfell, evidence of female company shortly before death. This time, the investigating authorities would remind of them, given that the sheriff and coroner were themselves knights, could not maintain the fiction of a random intruder. A pattern was suggested by 2 knights dead in identical fashion within a month, a targeted camper. In the colored community, the whispers grew louder. La Fiouf Noir, they called her Na, the Black Widow, the woman who seduced a powerful white men and left them dead in their beds. Some spoke of her with fear, worried that she would bring reprisals down on the entire Freedmen's population. Others spoke with a grim satisfaction, a sense that justice, denied through official channels, was being delivered through other means. Because the thing that white authorities refused to acknowledge, the thing that a free-colored personality, Martin Bavarish knew without needing to be told, was that Celeste Dufresne had not chosen her victims randomly. Every man she seduced, every man she killed, had blood on his hands. Real blood, not metaphorical. Each of them had personally participated in violence against freedmen and their families. Thomas Broussard had overseen multiple whippings and had burned the cabin of a freedman who'd filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau. Antoine Les had defended Klan members in court by intimidating colored witnesses, threatening their families, ensuring that justice was never served. With each subsequent victim, the pattern would continue, though white authorities would never make these connections, would never act why these specific men were targeted. On August 12, the remaining 9 nights had an emergency meeting in the hotel's back room. The Thursday night gatherings were no longer sufficient. Immediate action was demanded by the situation. They needed to identify the killer. They needed to protect themselves. They needed to restore order before panic spread through the white community. It was Judge Thibodeau who first voiced what several of them had been thinking but hadn't dared to say aloud. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "we must consider the possibility that the killer is someone we know, someone who has access to these men's homes, someone they trusted enough to let down their guard." The room fell silent. They all understood the implication. In their own beds, Broussard and Les had been killed, apparently without struggle, apparently after intimate activities. The killer had to be someone they would admit to their private quarters, someone whose presence wouldn't alarm them. "A woman," Dior Aber said quietly. "It would have to be a woman." With growing horror, they looked at each other as the pieces fell into place. A beautiful woman recently arrived in town. A woman who had, one way or another, attracted the attention of every man in the room. A woman whose background, now that they thought about it carefully, was strangely fake, supported only by her own testimony and the general plausibility of her story. "Madame Dafra," Sheriff Deferau said. "Mother of God. It's Madame Dafra." But even as they reached this conclusion, even as they began to discuss how to investigate her, how to prove her guilt, how to arrest her without causing a scandal, they faced a terrible problem. Each of them had spent time alone with her. Each of them had, in ways they hadn't admitted even to themselves, been seduced by her. Each of them had secrets they didn't want exposed, visits to her hotel room, gifts they'd given her, promises they'd made. To investigate her would be to investigate themselves, to invite scrutiny they couldn't afford. And beneath their fear and anger ran another current, one that none of them would acknowledge. Fascination. Because even knowing what she might be, what she might have done, Several of them couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop remembering the way she'd looked at them, touched them, made them feel like men of power and importance rather than bitter remnants of a dying world. Before we go further into this dark tale, I need you to understand something. This story gets deeper, more twisted than anything you've heard before. If you're feeling that chill down your spine, if you're asking yourself how this went, you need to hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with your theory about what happens next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now because we're about to reveal how this came if death bled, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Let's continue. The investigation into Celeste Dufresne began with careful discretion. From New Orleans, Judge Thibodeau used his authority to quietly request information, sending telegrams to police contacts and courthouse clerks, asking about a Creole widow named Dufresne whose husband had supposedly died in the yellow fever outbreak. The responses, when they came, were troubling. No merchant named Dufresne had died in New Orleans during the epidemic. No death certificate existed for anyone matching that description. A boarding house with the address Celeste had provided as her New Orleans residence, whose owner had no recollection of anyone named Dufresne. It was as if the woman had materialized from thin air, her entire past a fabrication. Meanwhile, Sheriff Devereaux began discreetly questioning hotel staff and local shopkeepers. What he learned painted a portrait of a woman who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. She kept regular dinners, attended church, purchased normal household items, but no one could say they really knew her. She had no friends, no confidants, no visitors except the various knights who had called on her. Her room was always neat, her behavior always proper, but there was something about her that people found difficult to describe, not threatening exactly, but unsettling in a way they couldn't articulate. More informative proved the colored servants at the hotel, though only when questioned privately and with assurances of protection. A housemaid named Rachel reported that Madame Dufresne's room contained no personal effects beyond basic necessities, no photographs, no letters, no mementos of a deceased husband. Just clothes, toiletries, and a lock trunk that she never saw opened. The room always smelled of lavender, even when Madame wasn't present, as if she'd infused the very walls with her scent. More tellingly, Rachel had twice seen Madame Dufresne return to the hotel very late at night, while after midnight, entering through a side door and moving through the hallways like a shadow. On both occasions, she'd been carrying what looked like a leather medical bag, though what business a widow would have with such items, Rachel couldn't imagine. While the investigation proceeded, the knights implemented security measures. Those with families sent them to relatives in other parishes, claiming business necessities. Those who lived alone hired codes, former Confederate soldiers who patrolled their properties at night. They ferried their routines, changed their locks, kept loaded pistols within reach. They stopped going out after dark unless in groups. With suspicion, they treated every sound, every shadow. And they waited for the next death, because they all understood with grim certainty that it was coming. The third today was Dior, Raymond Deber, found in his medical office on August 27 th with his throat cut and his body ranged on his own examination table. The circumstances were nearly identical, evidence of female company, wine glasses present, that same peaceful expression contradicting the violence of his death. But a new element was included in this murder that sent leads through the survivor's fans. Pin to Dior, Hubert's chest with a surgical pin with a small piece of paper. On it, written in an elegant hand, were two words, "Remember Battle Road." Immediately, the knights understood what the message meant, though the local authorities and newspapers never would. In March of 1868, Dior Iber had traveled to Baton Rouge to testify in a federal inquiry into Klan violence. A colored woman named Sir Boudreaux had accused several white men, including Knights from St. Martin Parish, of attacking her husband and burning their home. Dior Iber had testified that Sir's husband had died not from injuries inflicted by the attackers, but from pre-existing health conditions, a lie that had helped the accused men go free. 3 months later, Sir Boudreaux had been found dead in a rooming house in New Orleans, her throat cut. The crime was officially attributed to robbery, though nothing had been taken. The note made clear that Celeste knew about this incident. More than that, it suggested a connection to that, a personal investment in seeing Dior Iber punished for his role. But how could she know? How could a Creole widow from New Orleans have such detailed knowledge of Klan activities in Baton Rouge 4 years earlier? The answer came from an unexpected source. Reviewing old newspaper reports and court documents, Judge Thibodeau discovered that Sir Boudreaux had not been alone when she died. She'd had a daughter, approximately 12 years old at the time, who had disappeared after her mother's murder. No record existed of what became of the girl. She'd simply vanished into the chaos of a post-war Louisiana, one more displaced child among thousands. To the night's next meeting, held in Jessup's hotel on a Tuesday night, moved from their usual Thursday schedule in an attempt to break any predictable pattern, the judge brought this information. He led at the timeline. Sir Boudreaux murdered in 1868. Her daughter disappeared. Anna, 4 years later, a mysterious woman appears in Brow Bridge and begins systematically killing the man responsible for that murder and for the broader campaign of terror against freedom. She's the daughter, Jessup said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mother of God, she's Sir Boudreaux's daughter. Came back for revenge. But that theory had problems. Celeste appeared to be in her 30s, far too old to be the girl who had disappeared in 1868. Unless her entire appearance was a carefully constructed fiction, her age, her background, her identity, all lies designed to gain access to her targets. Unless she'd spent 4 years planning this campaign, learning who had been responsible, tracking them to their current locations, preparing herself for the role she needed to play. Even more deeply, the racial implications of the theory troubled them. If Celeste was Sir Boudreaux's daughter, she was colored, despite her light skin and refined manner. She had passed as Creole, as white enough to move through their society without suspicion. Every man she'd seduced had committed what Louisiana law still considered miscegenation, a crime and a Mauristan. The scandal would destroy them, even if they survived her revenge. We need to take her now, Sheriff Devereaux said. Tonight. Arrest her before she kills again. But Judge Thibodeau shook his head. On what charge? We have no proof. The notes can't be used as evidence without revealing what they reference. Our own investigation is compromised because we've all been involved with her. Any try would expose everything we've tried to cancel. Then we don't have a trial, Marcus Thibodeau said quietly. The newspaper editor had been silent until now, but his meaning was clear. We handle this the way we've handled other problems. Quietly. Vehemently. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. They were discussing murder, lynching, the extrajudicial killing of a woman who had not been convicted of any crime. It was exactly what they'd done to countless freedmen over the years. It was what they'd done to Sir Boudreaux herself. The irony was not lost on any of them, but their fear of fraud any moral cause. They voted, as they always did, on important matters. 9 men remained in the knight's inner circle. 9 hands raised in agreement. They would kill Celeste Dufresne before she could kill Eken. But as they made their plans, none of them noticed that the hotel's serving girl, a young colored woman named Marie, who had been clearing classes in the hallway, had heard every word through the meeting room's thin walls. And none of them saw her slip away into the night, moving quickly toward the colored section of town, toward a small church where certain people gathered, people who had learned long ago that their survival depended on knowing what white folks planned before those plans could be enacted. By dawn, everyone in the freedmen's community knew that the knights intended to murder Laufey Noir. And through channels that white authorities had never understood and never would, a message was passed to the hotel, to room 7, where a widow in mourning clothes sat at a small desk, adding notes to her leather journal. Celeste read the message, a single line scrawled on brand paper, and smiled. She had expected this. In fact, she had counted on it. Because the thing about rage, about the desire for revenge, was that it made the people predictable. The knights thought they were hunting her, but they'd failed to understand a crucial truth. From the moment she arrived, she'd been hunting them, and the hunt was far from over. Her few belongings she packed into her trunk, settling her account with the hotel desk clerk by mid-morning. She told him she'd received word of business requiring her return to New Orleans, thanked him for his hospitality, and arranged for her trunk to be taken to the steamboat dock. By noon, Celeste Dufresne had left Bridge, boarding a steamboat headed south. When they learned of her departure that evening, the knights felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She'd escaped, but at least she was calm. At least the killings would stop. They had no way of knowing that the woman on the steamboat was not Celeste at all, but a freed woman named Shaula, who bore a passing resemblance and who wore borrowed clothes and a heavy veil. They had no way of knowing that the real Celeste had never left the parish, that she'd moved instead into the colored section of town, into a small house behind the freedmen's church, where she was welcomed as a sister, as an avenger, as the instrument of justice that the law had denied them. And they had no way of knowing that the murders, far from ending, were about to escalate. On September 3, Eugene Fontenot died, not in his bed, but on the road between his dry goods tower and his home. At dawn, he was found in his wagon, throat cut, his horse grazing peacefully nearby. The placement of the body suggested he'd been traveling with someone, a companion who had waited until they were alone on a stretch of dark road before striking. A companion he trusted enough to let sit beside him in the darkness. Remember the Fontenot's tower fire, read the note pinned to his chest. In November of 1869, 3 freedmen had tried to open a competing generous tower in Bridge, offering credit terms to colored customers that Fontenot's establishment refused. Within a week, the North Tower had burned to the ground. The 3 men had fled the parish, their families with them, and no investigation had ever been conducted. Everyone knew who had ordered the fire. Not everyone knew the price of that knowledge. Next was Philip Rousseau, the banker. On September 15, he died in his own bank, discovered when the clerks arrived in the morning. He'd been killed at his desk, apparently while working late on accounts. With such force had his throat been cut that blood had spattered across the ledger's head بالرفيون. The note referenced a loan head foreclosed in 1870, driving a freedman farmer into destitution and homelessness, a foreclosure that violated the bank's bond policies, but that had been approved because the debtor was colored. 5 men died in 2 months. Unmistakable now is the battle, not just to the knights, but to the entire parish. Someone was systematically executing the most powerful men LST, mountain bearish, men who had thought themselves untouchable, protected by their positions and their brotherhood. And somehow, despite all their precautions, despite the codes and the locked doors and the loaded weapons, the killer kept finding ways to reach them. The federal authorities, who had largely stayed out of local affairs since the early days of Reconstruction, now took notice. From Baton Rouge, U.S. Marshal arrived with instructions to investigate the murders and determine whether they constituted an attack on civilian government that required military intervention. The Marshal, a severe man named Holbrook who had fought for the Union and had little sympathy for former Confederates, began his inquiry by questioning the surviving Knights. What he found troubled him in ways he hadn't expected. The victims were all members of the same organization. All had participated in documented violence against freedom. All had been killed in a manner suggesting intimate access and personal revenge. The notes left on the bodies referenced specific crimes that federal investigators had tried and failed to prosecute, intimidated witnesses and corrupt local courts. Dozens of people Marshal Holbrook interviewed, white and colored, men and women, local residents and recent rifles. He examined crime scenes, reviewed coroner's reports, studied the pattern of attacks, and gradually he pieced together the story of Celeste Dafra, the mysterious widow who had seduced and killed at least 3 of the victims, possibly all 5. But when he tried to locate her, he discovered she'd vanished. The steamboat manifest showed a failed woman matching her description had deported for New Orleans, but authorities there had no record of her rifle. She'd simply disappeared, as if she'd never existed at all. Then Holbrook did something unusual. He began interviewing members of the freedmen's community, not as suspects, but as potential witnesses. He spoke to church elders, to women who ran boarding houses, to men who worked as laborers and craftsmen. He made it clear that he was interested in justice, not in protecting white criminals. And gradually, people began to talk. They told him about La Fille Noire, the Black Widow, though none of them claimed to have seen her personally. They told him about the notes that had circulated through the community, messages from someone who knew things that only a freed person would know, someone who understood the specific crimes committed by each victim. They told him about the daughter of Sir Boudreaux, though no one could say with certainty where she was or what she looked like now. And one elderly man, a freedman named Isa, who had worked as a carpenter before the war and who now served as a deacon in the church, told him something that changed the Marshal's understanding of the case entirely. "You're looking for one woman," Isa said. "One killer? But that ain't how it works. You think one person could move through this parish killing white men and not be caught? You think one woman could know all the things that needed knowing, be in all the places she needed to be, without help?" Holbrook leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Isa replied carefully, "that justice is a heavy burden, too heavy for one person to carry alone. I'm saying that when the law fails people, that he find other ways, other means. And I'm saying that maybe you should stop looking for a single killer and start asking yourself why no one, not one colored person in this entire parish, has given you any information that would help catch her. Why we all seem to have gone blind and deaf when it comes to La Fille Noire. It was the closest anyone would come to admitting the truth. That the freedmen's community was protecting the killer, or killers, because they viewed the murders not as crimes but as the justice delayed. That whatever was happening to the Knights was seen as righteous, necessary, and long overdue. An impossible situation faced Marshal Holbrook. He could arrest freedmen on suspicion of conspiracy, but that would require military force and would likely trigger the kind of racial violence he'd been sent to prevent. He could pressure the local courts to prosecute, but those courts were controlled by the very men being targeted, men who had no moral authority and no credibility with the colored population. He could call in federal troops and impose martial law, but that would be admitting that civilian government in Louisiana had completely broken down. Instead, he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He filed a report stating that the murders appeared to be the work of a transient criminal, possibly a woman calling herself Celeste Dafra, who had since fled the jurisdiction and was now subject to a federal warrant. He recommended that the remaining nights take appropriate precautions, but stated that without witnesses or physical evidence, further investigation was unlikely to yield results. Then he returned to Baton Rouge, leaving the parish to its own devices. Abandoned by federal authority, the surviving knights, Jessup, Thibodeau, Judge Thibodeau, Sheriff Defrow, Duplantis, and Orsino, understood they were on their own, facing an enemy they couldn't identify or locate, protected only by their own resources and diminishing courage. Into fortresses they turned their homes. They hired more cowards, bought more weapons, stopped going at less absolutely necessary. They moved in groups, never alone, never vulnerable. They reviewed their pasts, trying to determine which of their many crimes might have made them targets, which victim might have surviving families seeking revenge. And they waited for the next death, which came sooner than they expected. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror honesty, Martin Beberish intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support her content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On October 1, during the day, in the supposed safety of his plantation home, William Duplantis died. He'd been alone in his study reviewing accounts while three armed cowards betrayed the crimes outside. His throat was cut while he sat at his desk, his killer escaping through a window that had been unlatched from the inside, suggesting someone had prepared the exit in advance. The note on his body referenced the Christmas massacre of 1868, when Duplantis had led a night raid on a freedmen's settlement, burning homes and killing 5 men who had organized a voter registration drive. The federal investigators at the time had been unable to prove Duplantis' involvement despite multiple witnesses, because those witnesses had subsequently retracted their statements after receiving visits from masked men. 2 weeks later, Charles Orsino followed, killed in the warehouse where he stored his coat. He'd gone there with Sheriff Defrow and 2 deputies to inspect a reported break-in.